struggle. We know about Shea's visit to Ireland in the 1960s. We know about Jim Fitzpatrick's artwork, and also, I mean, Jim Fitzpatrick's artwork would have had an effect on me, I suppose, as a youth growing up, knowing about Cuba. It was hanging in my house, really. So that impacted me, I suppose, as well. And we also know about, you know, long-standing links, anti-imperialist links between Cuba and Ireland in terms of Castro supporting Ireland and supporting the hunger strikers and the national liberation movement in Ireland down through the decades. But I suppose I just want to talk about as a historian, what's missing, I suppose, for me anyway, is a comprehensive, now people can correct me if I'm wrong, I might be wrong, but a comprehensive scholarly work that looks at the transnational links between Ireland and Cuba, or indeed maybe a comparative study that looks at the sort of different revolutionary struggles, the different social bases that birthed the revolutionary struggles in Ireland. Also why maybe you could call the Irish struggle in these years not really revolutionary in Leninist terms, about, you know, replacing one social class with another, and why you could call the struggle in Cuba that. So there's work to be done on that in historical terms. I mean, as well, we could sort of look at as socialist Republican activists, or, you know, people on the left, basically why did one revolutionary struggle move towards socialism and the other didn't? These are huge questions that I'm not going to answer in a 5-minute talk. They're something the scholars could investigate going forward. I suppose one of the things that a comparative history might include, though, from the get-go, is the sort of triumphs of failure that led to revolutionary success of a form. So you had Moncada barracks in Cuba and the assault on Batista's forces, and you had 1916 in Ireland, obviously, and what was a failure, what was although you could argue it wasn't planned to be a failure. I mean, if the Asgard had made land, and if if McNeil, for example, hadn't issued a countermanding order, then it might not have been a failure. But either way, both turned out to be. But for Fidel Castro, at least, in his words, the attack on Moncada, although it failed, it was heroic and symbolic. That was the value of it. It was heroic and symbolic, and likewise 1916. So, you know, even if both did fail, and both the leaders of both were tortured and executed, there was movements that were birthed out of them, and there was parallels in what happened after as well, or parallels in at least as far as Fidel Castro. When he stood trial for the attack, he utilised the courtroom in the way that many Irish Republicans had utilised it a century previously, from Emmett through to the Fenians. He used it as a propaganda tool. That's an interesting parallel that could be investigated. But I suppose this question of national freedom was also something that there's parallels to be thought about with what the meaning of national freedom. What was the meaning of national freedom was contested, of course, in both countries. So in Shea, in his writings, in one of his writings in particular, the Cadres, the backbone of the revolution, he talked about how really the revolution began as a sort of revolutionary nationalist revolution, but then he said through sort of strokes of spontaneity were the words he used, it developed into a socialist revolution. So Shea also said about Fidel that he actually began as a revolutionary nationalist and developed later into a socialist. So we know as well, Markievicz, that she was involved in the ICA. She was the Irish Citizen Army. But why then did the years 1917 to 1918 birth what was really a conservative nationalist movement? Kevin O'Higgins, for example, infamously boasted that the revolution that was put through was one of the most conservative than any revolutionaries ever put through in history. So we need to sort of think about those differences, I think. I think the main point about it is really the social base and the sort of religious base maybe as well of the revolutionaries was different, and that this really meant that some of the revolutionaries in Ireland really, instead of upending the colonial and classist system that existed in Ireland, they simply wanted to fit into it and really wield the levers of power as before, except, as we know, Connolly alluded to, with a harp above the harp above Dublin Castle rather than the Union Jack. But the 26th of July movement in Cuba wasn't a sort of monolith either. It did have its left and right wings, and Shay talked about this in the same writings that I alluded to earlier, this internal struggle in the movement, and this really led to problems amongst seized state power. The cadres that were needed to run the state, they weren't formed, or that they were lacking, so they couldn't wield the sort of power they needed to in terms of the state apparatus. And I suppose there wasn't a strong base of cadres in Ireland either after 1922 and into 1923. Why? Because partition, the counter-revolution, the power of the Catholic Church, the industrialists, the media, the strong farmers, British imperialism, all this backed by British imperialism, moved to crush any sort of hopes of the revolution that took sort of place in Cuba, the type of revolution that would take place in Cuba later. So, I mean, there are analyses of the Civil War in Ireland that talk about it as a class struggle, and there were elements of it, but really when you look at it, it wasn't really a class struggle. It was more to do with the oath really, and the sort of form of freedom that Ireland wanted. But I mean, the point is that it was crushed, and this shut down any sort of potential for more freedom in the way that Cuba developed from a revolutionary nationalist position into a socialist one. Ireland couldn't because of the counter-revolution here. So that would be the main difference. I mean, in Ireland as well, they were, the likes of Mellows, moving towards a stronger left position. He realised that the unions, the trade unions and the masses, the likes of the farm labourers strike led by the ITGWU in places like Kildare and Dublin and Waterford throughout the early 1920s, he realised that these are the things that should have been capitalised on, and that the masses should have been mobilised, but that was crushed by the counter-revolution and by partition, of course, something that wasn't a factor in Cuba. I mean, because of the counter-revolution, I mean, there were counter-revolutions in Cuba, of course, but they didn't succeed, gladly. So what we have now, in essence, 100 years later, is a stark contrast between Cuba and Ireland, where here we wallow in a housing crisis and in a healthcare crisis, but in Cuba, people are looked after from cradle to grave and no one is homeless. So Sinead, Gurmahagi, August, Berigi Buer and Quidella de Borshulo. Good night,
Go on, Kerron.